Gerald Harrison never imagined that a single flight could shatter his world. As he boarded the plane, he felt a quiet determination despite the undercurrent of tension swirling around him. His entrance into the terminal at LaGuardia was as smooth and deliberate as ever. Wearing a tailored dark suit with crisp white shirt and polished cufflinks, he moved with the assurance of a man used to commanding boardrooms. Yet there was an uneasy glimmer in his eyes that hinted at battles fought silently over years of prejudice. It all started when a man in a navy pinstripe suit, a man who seemed to relish every second of his unearned privilege, blatantly claimed Gerald's seat. Gerald politely stated his reservation for seat 3A, one he had booked long in advance. The man, his face twisted into a self-satisfied smirk, nonchalantly dismissed Gerald's claim without so much as an apology. The blatant disregard for his rights was the spark that ignited a deep-seated conflict. In that crowded terminal, the air was thick with tension as passengers whispered and exchanged knowing glances, accepting that Gerald, like so many before him, was expected to yield simply because of the color of his skin. His dignity was trampled in plain sight. The flight attendant, a young woman whose pleasant demeanor quickly gave way to a rehearsed apology, informed him of a last-minute change. This excuse, thinly veiled as a technicality, devalued every dollar he had spent on the premium experience he deserved. To add insult to injury, a boisterous passenger in a flamboyant Burberry blazer joined in with a laugh, sneering that such mix-ups happened to him all the time. Their tone stank of entitlement, and their casual cruelty deepened the chasm between those who belonged and those who were made to feel inferior. Gerald's calm exterior belied the storm of emotions raging within him. His voice, steady yet seething with unspoken fury, made it clear that he would not simply acquiesce to this injustice. He rejected the paltry offer of bonus miles and a free beverage with a firmness that startled those who overheard him. The room of stained first-class seats bore silent witness to his dignified stand against the unyielding tide of discrimination. In that moment, Gerald's understated rage was both a cry for justice and a promise of retribution. A promise that would eventually send shockwaves through the entire system of biased privilege. As the flight crew continued with their monotonous routines, oblivious to the brewing conflict, Gerald discreetly activated a clause in his company's policies. A clause that would mobilize a legal and public relations machine designed to confront injustices. This move was not about personal gain. It was about holding those in power accountable for their cruelty. Meanwhile, in the reassigning of seats that followed his initial confrontation, Gerald found himself demoted to economy. His new seat in row 22 bore the physical scars of neglect, a sticky stain from a spilled juice box, and a cushion that reeked of indifference. The flight attendant named Curtis, whose arrogant tone and dismissive glance made it abundantly clear that Gerald's discomfort was of little consequence, attempted to placate him with a weak promise of a complaint lodged after landing. Every touch of the fabric, every leaked drop of condensation on his suit amplified the humiliation that had been forced upon him. But the most painful betrayal was the deliberate cold splash of sparkling water that drenched him minutes after he had managed to settle in. Curtis, now wearing an expression designed to feign shock while concealing malicious intent, apologized with a tone that was as rehearsed as it was insincere. Gerald, however, saw right through the facade. In the smooth, undisturbed flight, not even a bump could justify such a careless act. This deliberate act of cruelty deepened the chasm between him and the man behind the counter, a chasm that pitted dignity against venomous malice. The hurt was palpable, and the whispers among the passengers swelled as some looked away in embarrassment, while others, almost too politely, checked their watches. Gerald's composure was admirable, yet beneath that veneer, every small act of humiliation added another layer to the accumulating weight of injustice he had borne for too long. Across the aisle, a middle-aged woman holding a glass of Chardonnay expressed a petty complaint about the noise, completely oblivious to the true gravity of what was unfolding before her eyes. Her reaction, so trivial in the face of the blatant abuse, underscored the harsh societal divide that had become routine. A divide where the plight of one man seemed inconsequential compared to the comfort of those who had always taken their privilege for granted. In a series of quiet yet explosive moments, Gerald's actions began to take on an almost mythic quality. That single phone call he made was not a call for help. It was a command to initiate a process of accountability that would shake the very foundations of the biased system. With the cold efficiency of someone who had fought many battles, Gerald set in motion a mechanism that was destined to expose the crooked underbelly of privilege and discrimination. Even as he sat, drenched in water and emotionally wounded, his mind spun a web of meticulously planned retribution against those who had dared to diminish his worth. By the time the flight leveled out at cruising altitude, the atmosphere had irrevocably changed. The echoes of cruelty continued to reverberate in every corner of that plane, igniting a spark that promised a reckoning. Gerald's quiet call to arms was not merely an act of personal vengeance. It was a declaration of war against the entrenched prejudices that had long governed the lives of people like him. The emotional aftermath was a tapestry of despair mixed with a burgeoning hope, a hope that the scales of justice were finally being tipped in favor of those who had suffered silently for far too long. In that turbulent moment, as chairs creaked and fabrics soaked in the aftermath, Gerald's journey took on a new dimension. He was not just a victim of a careless, racist injustice. He was now a man on a mission to bring down the bastions of privilege that had so callously mistreated him. His measured steps toward the galley were accompanied by an internal promise that the upcoming retribution would be nothing short of magnificent. And as the plane continued its smooth journey across the skies, those who had once seen him as just another passenger were about to witness the reckoning of a lifetime. Gerald's story is not just about what happened on that flight. It is a reflection of the silent battles waged against an ingrained system of injustice, a story that underscores the profound human need for dignity and respect. And now, as the wheels of retribution begin to turn, one is left to wonder, how far will one man go to reclaim his honor? How will the scales of power, weighted by years of indifference, finally balance in the wake of such profound injustice? For anyone who has ever felt diminished or overlooked simply because of who they are, Gerald's fight is a testament to the strength of the human spirit, and a stirring reminder that even in the face of relentless cruelty, justice can still rise in a blaze of glory. Gerald Harrison continued his journey with quiet fury and a heavy sense of injustice weighing on his every move. When the crew announced that his seat had been reassigned to 10D and he was ushered away from the comfort of first class, his heart sank even further. As he followed Curtis down the aisle, Gerald's eyes widened in disbelief when he noticed a white couple being escorted from economy into premium seats, laughing and chattering as if they were returning home after a delightful vacation. Meanwhile, Gerald was left with a seat near the lavatory, a seat with a broken screen and an atmosphere that screamed neglect. The betrayal stung like a slap, and deep down, a slow-burning anger began to build into a resolve for more than just quiet resistance. When Curtis returned with Linda, the young attendant with clipped bangs and an overly tight smile, Gerald braced himself for further humiliation. Linda's voice, booming too loudly for comfort, announced that they needed to speak with him. The demand felt like a scripted performance, designed solely to embarrass him further. Gerald nodded slowly, masking the torrent of disdain swirling beneath his calm exterior. As Linda demanded to verify his identity with a government-issued ID, Gerald could feel every eye in the cabin locked onto him, their stares heavy with silent judgment. He questioned the necessity of such an invasive check for a seat that had been taken from him without warning. Linda's explanation came off as rehearsed and insincere, her words failing to bridge the chasm of prejudice that separated his dignity from the indifferent cruelty of those in power. The tension thickened when Curtis leaned in unnecessarily close as he scrutinized Gerald's ID, his actions a clear reminder of his status as nothing more than an inconvenience. Gerald's eyes narrowed as he calmly produced his driver's license and global entry card, a silent rebuke to the patronizing nature of the check. The public nature of the humiliation left him feeling cornered and exposed, yet it also ignited a spark of retribution within him. Across the aisle, a man dressed in a khaki vest and loafers remarked in a low, measured tone that Gerald should not have to prove his identity. Yet his words reeked of a patronizing justification for the discriminatory treatment that had become all too familiar. That man's casual assertion, dripping with smug acceptance of the hierarchy that relegated Gerald to the margins of society, cut deep. Gerald's mind raced as he absorbed the insult. The word legacy echoed in his thoughts, a term casually tossed around by those who believed that only a certain lineage or appearance belonged in first class. To them, Gerald was simply anyone, an interloper who did not meet their narrow standards of power and privilege. His heart pounded with both anger and sorrow as he recalled all the years he had spent fighting to build Langston Dynamics from humble beginnings to a global empire, only to be reduced in the eyes of these narrow-minded strangers to a mere inconvenience. The weight of their cruelty pressed upon him like an anchor, yet he refused to let them see the full extent of his hurt. In an effort to reclaim control, Gerald adjusted his posture and pressed the call button. When a young brunette named Carla finally appeared to attend to him, he demanded to speak with the lead flight attendant. He needed answers, and his voice was measured yet unwavering. Carla's confusion soon gave way to a hurried retreat as she returned with a stern-faced woman whose name tag read, Heather. Heather's tone was curt and authoritative as she explained that Gerald's seat had been reassigned due to a last-minute priority override, and that every action taken was in strict accordance with airline safety procedures and company policy. Gerald's incredulity was palpable as he fired back with pointed questions. Which policy permitted an invasive identity check for a confirmed ticket holder, and which clause justified the damage to his property? Heather's response was cold and impersonal, relying on legal jargon and bureaucratic defenses that did nothing to soothe the sting of discrimination. As she recited the company's policies, Gerald's thoughts turned to the larger pattern at work, a system that allowed the privileged to treat others with cruelty under the guise of operational efficiency. His calm facade masked the storm raging inside him, a torrent of anger and grief, fueled by decades of being marginalized simply because of the color of his skin. Amid the exchange, a soft voice interrupted from across the aisle. A woman in her early 40s who dared to criticize those who treated Gerald as if he were an unworthy intruder in first class. Although her words were meant to offer some semblance of solidarity, they also carried a bitter irony that underscored the widespread tolerance of injustice among many passengers. Heather's face hardened as she barked for the woman to lower her voice, reinforcing the idea that any deviation from the script was unacceptable. Gerald's gaze met the woman's for a fleeting moment, and in that silent exchange, he saw a reflection of both hope and the impossibility of genuine compassion in a system rigged against him. His voice broke the heavy silence as he declared plainly that he had endured more than his share of indignities. His seat was stolen, his property defiled, his right to dignity repeatedly questioned, and now he was being punished for daring to assert his worth. His carefully measured tone resonated with a calm determination that belied the storm within, a determination that promised retribution in due time. In that moment, Gerald's resolve crystallized into a plan that was both precise and formidable. With deliberate steps, he activated a series of commands on his phone, commands that would extract every detail of the flight's manifest, from the seat reassignment history to the crew roster and every trace of discriminatory policy embedded in the system. As the call went through and technical procedures commenced, Gerald's mind raced ahead to the impending reckoning. He was not just a victim of a series of unfortunate events. He was about to launch a counteroffensive that would expose the vile undercurrents running through the corridors of power on that plane. The cabin, once filled with the murmurs of complacent passengers, now buzzed with an undercurrent of anticipation. Gerald's quiet defiance was slowly transforming into a full-blown challenge to the entire system of privilege that had so cruelly humiliated him. When Heather returned with the news that his unauthorized communication device was supposedly a threat to flight safety, Gerald's response was a measured, almost ironic laugh. A laugh that acknowledged the absurdity of the situation. He reminded her that his device was fully compliant, encrypted, and posed no risk whatsoever. Yet, in her eyes, he saw the stubborn refusal of an institution unwilling to admit its own bias. Heather's final warning rang hollow in Gerald's ears as he continued to articulate his grievances with clarity and resolve. Every new hurdle thrown in his path only stoked the flames of his desire to turn the tables on those who believed they could simply dictate where he belonged. His words were not a cry for help. They were a declaration of war, a promise that the scales of justice would soon tip in favor of those who had suffered under the weight of systemic prejudice. In that moment, as the aircraft cruised steadily at 35,000 feet, Gerald Harrison stood at the threshold of a reckoning that would shake the very foundations of a discriminatory system. He was a man who had built empires from adversity, and now he was ready to dismantle the barriers that had long confined him. His every word and every measured action from that point forward was a testament to the enduring spirit of resistance. A resistance that promised not only to exact retribution, but to redefine the very notion of power in a world that had once dismissed him as insignificant. For anyone who had ever felt diminished or sidelined, Gerald's fight was not just a personal battle. It was a beacon of hope and defiance against the cruelty of systemic injustice. His journey was far from over, and as he looked out over the cabin filled with silent witnesses, he knew that the moment of transformation was at hand. The forthcoming retribution was not meant to be a mere punishment, but a dramatic surge of reclaiming his rightful place. A surge so powerful that it would leave onlookers in awe. A surge that would be remembered long after the flight had landed. In that charged atmosphere, where every accusation and every act of cruelty was countered by Gerald's implacable resolve, the stage was set for a climax that would change the lives of everyone on board. Gerald Harrison's transformation from a quiet victim into a man in full command reached its explosive crescendo as the atmosphere inside the plane grew thicker with tension. No one had seen escalation until that moment, when the very air seemed to vibrate with the promise of retribution. It all began when Heather, the so-called cabin supervisor, snapped that if Gerald would not cooperate, they would involve the captain. Her jaw clenched with indignation and her threat was cold and calculated. Gerald maintained a calm, even tone and insisted that if she wouldn't cooperate, then, by all means, involve the captain. Heather turned on her heel and strode down the aisle, her heels clicking like a retreating verdict against him. But before Gerald could even allow himself a breath of relief, a new figure emerged. A young pilot in crisp pilot blues, whose cocky demeanor and freshly minted silver wings did nothing to hide his disdain. He passed by without making eye contact, yet his muttered words were loud enough for Gerald to catch. "Doesn't surprise me. First class is too easy to fake these days. Flash a smile, drop a name, and they let anyone through." Those words struck Gerald like a sharp blade, slicing through the pretense of decorum, revealing the casual contempt that these privileged individuals wore like an accessory. Gerald turned his head slowly, watching that pilot vanish beyond the cockpit door, and for the first time since boarding, he felt something other than rage or humiliation. It was a cold, clear resolve. He understood that the soft-spoken yet poisonous language of institutions bending their own rules was a signal of deeper, systemic injustice. Around him, passengers resumed their murmurs, some pretending to be absorbed in their tablets, others furtively glancing his way, as if they were part of a covert court where he was both defendant and prosecutor. They had all written their lines in advance, assuming roles in a play that was meant to keep him subjugated and silent. But Gerald Harrison had just flipped the script. Quietly and deliberately, he opened a secure app on his phone, entered his secret passcode, and activated an internal trigger. In that instant, the hidden mechanisms of his company, Langston Dynamics, sprang to life. The Internal Affairs Division started monitoring the flight via satellite sync. Public behavior tracking and audio logs were initiated in real time. Every discriminatory word, every sneer, every calculated slight was being documented. Their system was now locked in motion, gathering evidence and triggering protocols that would soon pull every legal, corporate, and reputational string necessary to expose the bias that had scarred his dignity. This aircraft wasn't simply flying across the United States at 35,000 feet. It was hurtling toward an inevitable reckoning. The relief Gerald felt from knowing he was taking control mingled with the bitterness of humiliation. The fastened seatbelt sign had just turned off, and service carts manned by attendants whose smiles were as superficial as their scripted politeness began moving again. Curtis, the flight attendant whose earlier arrogance had stung him so deeply, now appeared with his sleeves rolled up to reveal an expensive watch and a tan that hinted at long vacations in exclusive country clubs. Curtis asked in his lackluster tone, "Meal service, sir?" without even meeting Gerald's gaze. Gerald's reply was measured and even, "Pasta, please." But there was no courtesy in Curtis's pause as he reached into his cart and then suddenly announced, "Actually, we've run out. The chicken is all gone." Gerald, keeping his composure, responded in a voice that betrayed no emotion. "Then I want the chicken," Curtis hesitated, and finally said with contrived cheer, "We only have one portion left because it was reserved for a medical request in row 5. Gerald's eyes locked with Curtis's for a split second before the attendant moved on, leaving behind only the clink of silverware and the mocking aroma of a warm meal that felt more like a taunt than comfort. Across the aisle, a man in a navy blazer, complete with a lapel pin resembling a flag, leaned into his own meal with casual disdain. He nonchalantly remarked, "You know, you could have avoided all this if you just sat where they told you to." His tone was as smooth as it was insulting, a reminder that Gerald's defiance in asserting his rightful seat was seen by some as mere troublemaking. Gerald said nothing in response. Instead, he let the man's words wash over him. But then the man continued, his voice laced with patronizing condescension. "It's always the same story. Someone makes a fuss, tries to push their way to the top, and then complains when they get pushback." The man took another bite of his chicken, chewed deliberately, and then added, as if offering unsolicited wisdom, "I get it. You think making noise forces respect. Problem is, respect is earned, not shouted for." Gerald slowly turned his head, his eyes hardening with resolve as he calmly replied, "You have something to say. Say it clearly." The man's smirk twisted into a look of thinly veiled irritation as he leaned in even closer. "I'm just saying, you might be more comfortable in a cabin that fits your background. That's not meant as an insult, just an observation." Gerald's response was measured, his tone steady but loaded with the weight of his accumulated pain. "No, what you are doing is framing your discomfort with my presence as logic, so you can feel righteous while staying ignorant." With a dismissive shake of his head, the man retorted, "It's not ignorance, it's structure. Some people try to take what doesn't belong to them and act like it's progress, while others inherit what they didn't earn and then claim it's merit." Gerald's eyes narrowed as he spoke softly but firmly. "Which one are you? Honestly, everything's always been about race. You're just not used to being called out for it." The man's jaw tensed as he dabbed at his mouth with a napkin and muttered under his breath, "That's the problem with this generation. Everything's about race now." Gerald responded, a quiet yet potent counter. "No, everything has always been about race, and you're only now having the gall to cover up your prejudice in polite conversation." Before the tension could fully boil over, a woman 2 rows ahead interjected with an irritated request. "Can you both keep it down? Some of us are trying to enjoy what we paid for." Gerald leaned forward slightly and asked, "You mean the silence?" The woman rolled her eyes and dismissed his query with a curt, "Whatever drama you brought with you, leave it out of the aisle." With that, the illusion of calm and neutrality, the facade of a peaceful flight, snapped back into place. A place where everyone pretended that neutrality was noble. where silence became complicity, and where the one who dared to resist was labeled a troublemaker. Sitting back in his seat, Gerald clasped his hands together as every muscle in his body tensed. He no longer felt simple anger. Now he felt the precision of a man whose every slight had been recorded in an internal ledger, a ledger that had finally reached its breaking point. He withdrew his secure phone from his pocket, a sleek, matte black device coded only for executive-level communications within his enterprise, and unlocked it with a single touch, his fingerprint the key that activated the final stage of his plan. His eyes remained fixed on the blank screen for a beat, and then he tapped a single, encrypted contact. There was no need for pleasantries. In 7 deliberate words, he spoke into the phone, words that carried the weight of retribution. "Activate Protocol B13, they've crossed the line." Without any further explanation, he ended the call. In that moment, somewhere deep within the corporate towers of Langston Dynamics, a chain reaction began. Legal teams, internal security, media strategy experts, and executive responses all synchronized into motion, precisely as they had been programmed to do under such triggers. Gerald's composed silence returned as he tucked his phone back into his pocket. But he was no longer the man merely enduring humiliation. Instead, he had seized control. Across the plane, the surface appearance of routine remained unchanged. But beneath it all, systems were being reconfigured to exact the retribution he had long been owed. The co-pilot's panel in the cockpit began to flash a silent alert in red, a signal that something unusual was unfolding. The co-pilot leaned over to the captain and said, "Priority escalation flag." His voice was low, laced with urgency. Minutes later, a call from corporate came flooding in through the cockpit. The captain, a seasoned professional with distinguished gray streaks along his temples and an aura of calm after years of crisis, frowned as he tapped his headset. "Flight 849, this is Captain Rowan, go ahead," he said. Silence hung for a few moments before a voice, cold and clinical, spoke through the channel. It was not FAA, nor was it from air traffic control. It was from Skylinks Airline's internal executive line. The message was terse. "Captain, you are instructed to initiate an internal compliance audit mid-flight, effective immediately. This is a direct order under new ownership protocol. You are to open secure file tag LDN B13, immediate briefing required." Captain Rowan blinked in disbelief, muttering, "New ownership?" The voice on the line replied, "Copy that." Rowan's fingers flew over the controls as he activated his secure terminal. A file labeled "Confidential Executive Authorization Langston Acquisition Confirmed" appeared on the small embedded screen. Beneath it was a photograph of Gerald Harrison, clearly marked as the owner and CEO. Just 3 weeks ago, he had acquired controlling interest in Skylinks Airlines, a move that now meant he held veto rights over all crew operations, even on this very flight. The captain's expression shifted from confusion to incredulity, and then to reluctant respect as he absorbed the reality that Gerald Harrison was no longer just a passenger fighting for dignity. He was now the future of the airline itself. Immediately, the captain instructed, "Get the lead attendant." Within moments, Heather was summoned into the cockpit, her face pale and expression strained as she entered. "Captain, is there a problem?" she asked tentatively. Captain Rowan fixed her with a steady look and said, "Why don't you tell me, Heather?" Her brow furrowed under his intense stare. "Sir, the gentleman in seat 10D has been difficult. There were some seating discrepancies and other issues," she began, but her voice faltered as Rowan cut her off. "From where I'm sitting, he owns this aircraft," Captain Rowan stated flatly. Shock and disbelief rippled through her face as she stuttered, I didn't know," before Rowan's calm authority silenced her further. "I suggest you return to the cabin immediately, inform your crew discreetly, and begin correcting the narrative before it reaches our media team," he instructed. His tone left no room for argument. Heather, now humbled and visibly shaken by the revelation, nodded silently and hurried back to the cabin. In that moment, every cold word she had uttered, every condescending smirk she had allowed in response to Gerald's rightful questions and grievances was turned against her. The very man she had treated as a problem was, in fact, the future, the owner of the company that paid her salary. After Heather exited, Captain Rowan's voice softened, though still carrying unwavering authority. "The captain has arranged for you to visit the forward cabin if you wish." His words resonated with quiet finality as Heather's steps became hesitant and her voice was reduced to a mere whisper. Gerald, watching it all unfold, felt a surge of vindication mixed with a bittersweet sense of justice served. Each injustice that had been suffered, each instance of degradation and racial discrimination, had built toward this moment of reckoning, one that would not only reshape his destiny, but also expose the rot at the heart of an institution that had long justified its cruelty through supposed protocol and priority. As the flight continued on its course from LaGuardia to LAX, Gerald Harrison remained seated, now with an air of quiet triumph that belied the turbulence of emotions swirling within him. The responses he had triggered were changing the narrative not just on this plane, but across the entire system that had once thought it could dismiss him with a mere reassignment of seats. Every disgruntled whisper, every dismissive glance, and every calculated slight was now being logged in an immutable ledger, a ledger that his company would use as evidence in a sweeping indictment against discrimination and systemic prejudice in corporate and aviation practices. In that charged cabin where passengers continued their in-flight rituals oblivious to the monumental shift occurring behind the scenes, Gerald's story was transformed from one of quiet suffering into a bold declaration of resistance. His measured actions, his calm yet razor-sharp responses, and his unwavering determination had forced a confrontation that no one on board could have foreseen. Here was a man who had built his empire from adversity, a man whose persistence had defied every obstacle placed in his path, now turning every insult, every act of cruelty into a weapon for justice. And as he sat there, with his eyes fixed on the gathering evidence on his secure phone and his mind orchestrating the next phase of retribution, Gerald knew that this was only the beginning. The power structures that had sought to diminish him were on the verge of being exposed, and the impending reaction would be nothing short of spectacular. A reckoning that would leave onlookers stunned and force those who had perpetuated discrimination to confront the consequences of their actions. For anyone who had ever felt the sting of prejudice in a world that pretended to value fairness, Gerald Harrison's bold stand was a rallying cry, a beacon of hope that reminded us that dignity cannot be stripped away without consequence. His story, now intertwined with corporate intrigue and regulatory overrides, became a narrative of transformation and redemption, where every act of silent defiance was met with a calculated response designed to upend an unjust system. Each recorded moment of his humiliation, each recorded slight from a flight attendant or a pilot was now a testament to the deep-seated bias that had been allowed to flourish unchecked. And as the internal protocols and legal engines of Langston Dynamics roared to life, set in motion by Gerald's deliberate command, it was clear that the once powerful forces of privilege were now being held accountable by the very man they had tried to silence. Within minutes, as the captain and his co-pilot worked to implement the internal compliance audit, an unsettling calm replaced the earlier chaos. The red alert on the co-pilot's panel symbolized a change not only in the technical operations of the flight, but in the very fabric of authority and respect aboard that plane. Gerald's quiet revolution had forced an internal realignment, a recalibration of power where those who had been unchallenged in their prejudice were suddenly confronted by a force greater than their own arrogance. It was as if the very skies were echoing his silent declaration that injustice, no matter how subtle, would no longer go unpunished. By the time the flight began its descent toward Los Angeles, the ripples of change had spread far beyond the narrow aisles of the aircraft. The corporate world, the media, and even regulatory bodies were now set to receive a detailed account of the events, complete with irrefutable evidence logged by Gerald's secure systems. The moment had arrived when the oppressed could claim their rightful dignity, when the scales of justice would finally tip in favor of those who had long been relegated to the margins by an elitist system. For the many who had silently suffered, the coming days promised to be a turning point. A dramatic, if not cathartic, reckoning that would transform humiliation into power, neglect into accountability, and every demeaning act into a stepping stone toward a brighter, fairer future. At that point, Gerald Harrison was no longer just a man who had been wronged. He was the embodiment of every person who had ever been diminished by a system steeped in prejudice. His carefully orchestrated response had not only set in motion a chain reaction that would shake the very foundations of that established order, but it also illuminated the stark truth that when injustice is met with unwavering resolve, the outcome is nothing short of revolutionary. The journey from humiliation to empowerment had been long and fraught with challenges, yet on that flight, high above 35,000 feet, every carefully measured step had led to this singular moment. A moment when one man's brave stand redefined what it meant to demand respect and justice in a world that had so often turned its back on him. Gerald Harrison stood at the head of the cabin with calm authority that transformed every whispered judgment into stunned silence. He had just received a full debrief per executive compliance procedure, and after studying the flight attendant before him for a moment, he adjusted the lapels of his blazer with quiet purpose and said, in a smooth, measured tone that was neither condescending nor vindictive, but carried an undeniable weight, "Thank you." His voice resonated throughout the cabin, and a sudden hush fell as heads turned to watch him. The woman 2 rows ahead, the same one who had earlier demanded he stop bringing drama, shifted uncomfortably in her seat and her cheeks flushed with embarrassment, while the man across the aisle, who had been casually scrolling through his financial app, slowly lowered his screen as he looked at Gerald with a dawning realization that here was no longer just an ordinary passenger, but an embodiment of authority. When Gerald reached the cockpit door, it swung open before he even had a chance to knock. Captain Rowan, a man whose experience was evident in the calm set of his features and the measured authority in his voice, greeted him warmly by saying, "Mr. Langston, welcome." Gerald entered the forward cabin, a space usually reserved for critical systems and top-secret briefings, but on that day it transformed into something resembling a boardroom at 35,000 feet. He accepted the digital pad from the captain, unlocked it deftly with a proprietary gesture code, and then revealed the true symbol of power in the sky, the Langston Dynamics Executive Override Clearance, a glowing blue sigil that bore the mark of Executive Tier 1 access. With precise and deliberate tone, Gerald began, "Effective immediately, you are instructed to initiate post-landing detainment of the following personnel pending an internal audit. I'm ordering the suspension of Heather Carson, Curtis Fields, and Linda Reyes." His announcement was neither boisterous nor angry, but it carried an impregnable sense of justice, a justice that had long been denied him and others like him. A full transcript of crew-to-passenger interactions has been flagged for review under code LDN-14. The captain will deplane through the service hatch once we arrive. Ground operations are to redirect the media feed immediately, for we will be issuing a statement, he continued, his tone unyielding and calm, as if these words were as natural as a gentle breeze. Captain Rowan, with a nod of understanding that displayed both respect and apprehension, responded, "Understood, sir." Then, in a moment of unexpected vulnerability, he hesitated and said, "Sir, I apologize for how this was handled." Gerald fixed his gaze on the captain, his expression not cold or unforgiving but resolute, and replied simply, "It wasn't just handled poorly, it was systemic." With that, he turned and exited the cockpit, now walking down the very aisle in which he had suffered humiliation and degradation merely hours earlier. Every step he took was measured and deliberate, echoing with the quiet thunder of a man reclaiming his dignity and authority. Passengers who once had looked upon him with condescension or indifference now straightened in their seats as he passed by, Some even lowered their eyes in deference, while others could not help but murmur, their whispers tinged with uncertainty about the sudden realignment of power. When he reached his assigned seat, Gerald did not sit down. Instead, he stood resolute beside it and reached for his second secure device. In a hushed tone that barely rose above a murmur yet carried through the cabin with clarity, he said, "Legal, prepare public release under Statement Package C. Include video logs from the cabin feed with the timestamp at 34 minutes after takeoff. Use phrasing that clearly states ownership present, leadership engaged, and policy failure acknowledged. Distribute this to press outlets, starting with Forbes, then CNBC, followed by Tech Insider." He paused to let the gravity of his orders settle, and then added softly, "Ensure that this is not just a headline, but a new standard." His words cut through the atmosphere like a finely honed blade. Behind him, Heather had returned to the galley, but she remained silent and motionless, her hands clasped too tightly, as if to hold back a torrent of regret. Curtis, who had earlier projected a veneer of self-assurance, now leaned against a nearby cabinet with arms crossed, his posture rigid and his expression drained of all confidence. Only Linda sat in the jump seat, her eyes wide and unfocused, as if she were still trying to process the enormity of the reversal in hierarchy that had unfolded before their very eyes. The rest of the crew avoided eye contact, each absorbed in the shock and humiliation of being overthrown so publicly. The plane was no longer the same vessel of routine service it once had been. The man whom they had ridiculed and demeaned just hours ago now held the authority to rewrite their careers and impose accountability for their actions. Yet Gerald did not gloat or revel in his newfound power. He did not shout in triumph. Rather, he calmly documented every transgression, recorded each interaction, and issued orders that were exact and uncompromising. His demeanor was as cold and calculated as the finest piece of machinery in his corporation, a device that operated with ruthless efficiency when provoked. This measured response, delivered without any overt display of fury, was perhaps the most devastating blow he could ever inflict on those who had sought to diminish him. For sometimes, power wielded with quiet precision cuts deeper and causes far more damage than any uncontrolled outburst. Minutes later, the captain's voice filled the cabin in an unusually formal tone. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are beginning our final descent. Please return your seats to the upright position and secure your belongings. We thank you for your cooperation." This time, however, the message landed differently. Every person on board was forced to reckon with the reality that the world outside the fuselage had irreversibly changed. Those who had earlier indulged in petty remarks or cast surreptitious glances at Gerald now fidgeted in their seats. They were unsure whether to look up in admiration or down in fear, uncertain if they too might be called to account for their previous silence. Up front, the captain's voice returned, calm and measured with corporate precision. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Los Angeles International Airport. We ask that all passengers remain seated. There will be a brief hold prior to deplaning due to coordination with airport authorities." Each word was deliberately chosen, respectful yet cautionary, as if acknowledging that the order of things was no longer the same. Gerald Langston. Yes, he remained that name despite the many challenges thrown his way, stood by his seat, his hand resting lightly on its back. His face was impassive, but beneath that still surface raged a storm of meticulously orchestrated systems now unfolding. Even before the wheels had ceased their rolling, Skylinx's executive oversight division had received Gerald's comprehensive compliance report. Within 10 minutes of touchdown, the tarmac outside was lined with black SUVs, adorned with the discreet insignia of Langston Dynamics' Internal Ethics Task Force and Corporate Audit Team. 4 senior officers dressed in dark suits that contrasted sharply against the brilliant California sun waited patiently near the descending jet bridge. Their eyes, fixed on the unfolding drama, glimmered with the readiness of men and women well versed in the language of corporate discipline. Inside, Heather's complexion had gone pale. She stood trembling near the reflective glass of the jump seat cabinet, unable to grasp the rapid deterioration of her status. Curtis, once the confident and unyielding attendant, was now a shell of his former self, his jaw clenched so tightly that it seemed to have become permanently fixed. Linda, having long since ceased speaking, sat silently in the jump seat, her hands trembling, as if replaying every decision and every cruelty from the past 6 hours in excruciating detail. Then came the first call from the first officer announcing, "Cabin doors are now open for deplaning. Please proceed in an orderly fashion." But the welcome that followed was starkly different from the one the crew had expected. The lead compliance officer, a tall man with a measured pace and a clipped, precise tone, stepped forward onto the jet bridge. His voice, devoid of any sentimentality, announced clearly, "Heather Carson, Curtis Fields, and Linda Reyes, by order of the Executive Board, you are hereby relieved of duty pending immediate administrative review." His words echoed in the quiet corridor, and a ripple of shock passed through the remaining crew as they exchanged glances, fraught with dread. Heather began to rise slowly as if to protest. Her lips parted in silent appeal, but no words came. She knew too well that any resistance would only hasten the process of her formal misconduct investigation, a matter that, in a case as high profile as this, would leap directly beyond human resources and crash into the Public Ethics Board. A gasp rippled through the nearby passengers, and even those who had once sneered now looked on with a mixture of astonishment and the slightest hint of sympathy. Curtis muttered something under his breath about the situation being a mistake. Though his tone revealed little hope of changing the course of events, the compliance officer, unfazed by Curtis's quavering protest, stated firmly, "Your job is to follow policy, not to indulge in personal biases or arbitrary notions of pedigree." Linda attempted to speak, saying, "I didn't mean," but her words were cut short by the officer's raised hand. "Everything from this point forward will be recorded and entered into your review transcripts. I suggest that you speak only to your counsel regarding your next steps," he admonished, his voice leaving no room for argument. One by one, the crew was escorted off the aircraft, not in handcuffs, but in a silence that roared louder than any siren, the heavy sound of accountability echoing in every step they took down the center aisle. Passengers instinctively parted ways, some averting their eyes while others watched with an unabashed, almost fascinated intensity. Retribution, once an abstract concept whispered about in lonely corridors of corporate power, now materialized on that jet bridge as undeniable and step-by-step justice. Gerald remained perfectly still, standing where he had once been humiliated, his gaze unwavering and his presence a testament to the transformative power of measured retribution. Even as he had not uttered a single word since the wheels touched down, Gerald's silence spoke volumes. He did not need to roar out his demands or express his outrage with fevered speech, because his power now emanated from structure and decisiveness, qualities that left an indelible mark on everyone present. A few moments later, another executive officer approached him directly on board, stating matter-of-factly, "Sir, the boardroom has issued full authorization to proceed. All data, crew records, and passenger statements have been secured." Gerald simply nodded once, his face a mask of calm resolve, and then, in a firm tone, replied, "Press embargo until tomorrow morning. We will conduct a remote press briefing from headquarters. Ensure that the public timeline and internal audit protocol are maintained as discussed." The officer, his words barely audible over the hum of orchestrated chaos, clarified that while leaks were inevitable, official language had already been disseminated to select media outlets. Gerald's measured command then concluded with, "Let the silence speak for itself for now." He turned toward the cabin, his eyes scanning the faces of those who had, not long before, ridiculed him, treated him as an inconvenience, or cast suspicious, judgmental glances his way. Now, those very faces bore expressions of quiet uncertainty. A few passengers offered him a small nod of respect that was both cautious and sincere, while others simply averted their eyes in deference or uncertainty. The terminal outside the aircraft buzzed with its usual noise: announcements, footsteps, distant chatter. But within the executive wing of Los Angeles International Airport, a different kind of quiet had settled. A calm, measured, and intentional quiet that hinted at systemic change in progress. Gerald Langston, still standing before the wide pane of glass that overlooked the tarmac, saw his reflection superimposed on the departing aircraft. Behind him, his legal team murmured updates and coordinated schedules, and screens flickered with live updates of statements being prepared for the morning press run. Yet, in that reflective moment, Gerald remained perfectly centered. This was not merely about damage control or quelling the media frenzy. It was about redirection, ensuring that the weight of the injustice he had suffered and the injustice suffered by countless others would catalyze meaningful reform. The transformation had to take root and spread far beyond the transient glare of corporate reprimands or fleeting headlines. It needed to become a fundamental change in the way power was exercised and accountability was enforced. Just as he turned toward the private corridor that would lead him to his car, a soft, uncertain voice called out from behind him. "Mr. Langston?" Gerald paused and glanced over his shoulder to see a young woman in her early 20s with light brown curls neatly pulled into a bun. Her uniform was slightly wrinkled, and though her eyes held a mixture of fear and determination, they shone with a quiet plea for acknowledgement. Her name tag read Grace, a name Gerald recognized from earlier when she had stood silently near the service station during meal service, her gaze downcast and her posture radiating discomfort as Curtis and Heather had laughed and deceived. Now she stood a little taller, though her hands still trembled ever so slightly. In a small, almost apologetic voice, she said quickly, "I know you probably do not want to hear from me, but I could not leave without saying something." Gerald offered a slight nod, his expression open but wary. Grace continued, her tone earnest and trembling with raw sincerity. "I saw everything that happened. I couldn't speak up then because I was scared of losing my job, scared of being drawn into all of this. But now, seeing what has unfolded, I realize that silence is no longer an option." Gerald listened intently, nodding as he absorbed every word. Grace's apology was not a plea for forgiveness for inaction, but rather a recognition of her own shortcomings, a vow to stand up and help correct a system that had been rigged against people like him for far too long. After a long moment of silence, Gerald spoke. "I am launching an internal reform program called Airborne Equity. It is designed to hold those in power accountable, to ensure that every act of discrimination, no matter how subtle, is met with immediate and unyielding transparency. You will receive a message from my team shortly. There is a pilot program starting next quarter, and if you are serious about helping us build something better, you will be a part of it." Grace's eyes widened with disbelief and gratitude in the same instant. "Thank you, truly," she managed, her voice soft yet sincere. Gerald allowed the faintest of smiles, replying, "We do not require perfect allies, only brave ones who are willing to stand up when injustice is at hand." With that, Grace nodded fervently and stepped back into the crowd of arriving passengers, her posture now noticeably firmer, signaling the beginning of her transformation. Gerald then turned his attention back to his duties, the weight of the moment returning to the forefront of his mind. As he headed toward the private elevator that would take him to his next engagement, he could not help but glance back toward the cabin. He saw Heather, Curtis, and Linda, now mere shadows of the figures who had once terrorized his sense of self, standing subdued in the once familiar confines of the airplane. Their faces, etched with a mix of fear, regret, and resignation, bore silent testimony to the irrevocable change that had just occurred. These were the very individuals who had embodied the cruelty and systemic bias that had for so long been shielded by corporate protocol and indifferent bureaucracy. Now, they were facing the full force of accountability in a way that would forever alter not only their careers, but their lives. For anyone who had ever been made to feel invisible or inferior by an institution built on discrimination, Gerald Harrison's transformation was an unequivocal declaration that injustice would no longer be tolerated. His deliberate, clinical, and powerful response echoed far beyond the narrow aisles of the aircraft. It was a moment of reckoning. A moment when every slight, every demeaning comment, every instance of racial prejudice was met with a counterforce so organized and so inevitable that it rendered the old order obsolete. His actions were not driven by unchecked fury, but by a strategic, carefully measured response that cut as deeply as any outburst of anger, precisely because it was rooted in years of accumulated injustice and the certainty that change was long overdue. When the lead compliance officer finally stepped forward onto the jet bridge and escorted the disgraced crew off the aircraft, the atmosphere was charged with a sense of history in the making. The routine business of a flight had given way to an unprecedented spectacle of corporate justice unfolding in real time. Gerald stood immovable as the last of the crew members disappeared down the aisle, his eyes fixed on the horizon outside the terminal. His steady gaze, the unwavering set of his jaw, and the resoluteness in his quiet words communicated a message that was impossible to ignore. Accountability was coming, and those who had abused their power would be held responsible for every betrayal, every act of cruelty, and every instance of racial discrimination they had inflicted. Even as the sounds of the terminal, announcements over the intercom, the murmur of arriving passengers, and the distant hum of vehicles outside filled the air, a different kind of music played in Gerald's heart. It was the music of vindication, of long-sought justice finally beginning to unfold. His internal systems, set in motion with a simple yet definitive command, had already triggered a chain reaction deep within the corporate structure. Data was being secured, records were being compiled, and a live press release was being readied for distribution to major outlets. By the time the first black SUVs rolled up to the jet bridge, it was clear that what had happened on that flight would not be swept under the rug. It would become a defining moment in the fight against systemic racial bias and corporate indifference. As Gerald prepared to leave the terminal, stepping into the private corridor that led to his waiting car, he took one last look back at the building where, earlier, he had been humiliated and belittled. Now it stood as the backdrop to a stunning reversal of power, a place where the voices of the marginalized were being amplified through every recorded document and every whispered accusation now transformed into undeniable evidence. His reflection in the glass, commanding, inscrutable, determined, symbolized the start of something larger than himself, a movement that would spread far beyond the confines of that single flight, touching countless others who had been forced to endure similar indignities. At that moment, as Gerald's legal team murmured updates and schedules behind him and live screens showed mounting evidence of the flight's events, he felt the weight of his responsibility. He was no longer just a victim of systemic prejudice. He was a catalyst for change. His measured command had not only rewritten the narrative on that plane, but had sent ripples through an entire industry built on unchallenged authority and entrenched discrimination. The corporate structure he was now poised to reform would serve as a blueprint for accountability, a new era where every act of demeaning behavior would be met with a swift and resolute response. For every individual who had ever felt diminished, overlooked, or silenced by an institution that valued pedigree over potential and appearance over merit, Gerald Harrison's resolute stand was a beacon of hope, a promise that the day of reckoning had come. His transformation from being the target of racial bias and corporate indifference to becoming the embodiment of accountability was a story that resonated deeply with anyone who had ever been made to feel inferior simply because of their skin color or their background. In his rise, there was not only a personal victory but a triumph for justice, respect, and the undeniable truth that no one should ever have to endure humiliation without the promise of retribution. As Gerald finally stepped into the private elevator, his every step echoed like the beat of a drum, steady, unyielding, and imbued with the conviction of a man who had turned his suffering into a strategic weapon against oppression. He knew that the road ahead would be fraught with challenges, that the old guard would not relinquish their power without a fight, but he also knew that every injustice documented, every slight recorded, was a step toward a broader revolution in corporate governance and social equity. The story unfolding on that flight was merely the beginning, a testament to the fact that change, no matter how delayed, was inevitable when met with the quiet thunder of righteous retribution. For those listening to this tale, especially for those wise souls who have witnessed decades of subtle yet painful discrimination in a world that too often prioritizes appearance and legacy over fairness and merit, Gerald Harrison's saga is a reminder that dignity cannot be stripped away without consequence. His calm, strategic, and meticulously calculated actions have turned humiliation into an instrument of change, transforming the mere act of standing up for oneself into a monumental breakthrough in the fight for justice. His is a legacy of resilience, a demonstration that even in the face of systemic bias and entrenched corruption, one individual's determination to reclaim his rightful place can send shockwaves through every echelon of power. Standing there, with the soft murmur of his legal team in the background and the quiet determination of change etched on his face, Gerald Harrison became more than a man wronged by the system. He became the embodiment of every person who had ever been made to feel less than worthy. A living, breathing declaration that when injustice is met with measured response and unyielding resolve, the very foundations of tyranny begin to crumble. His story, unfolding across the miles of tarmac and the corridors of corporate power, is destined to be remembered as a turning point in history, a moment when the scales of power were forever tipped in favor of those who had long been denied their true measure of dignity and respect. As he prepared for the next stage of his journey, a remote press briefing that would broadcast his truth to the world, Gerald Harrison knew that the battles fought on that fateful flight were not isolated incidents. They were the culmination of years of silent suffering and unspoken indignities endured by countless individuals who had been marginalized by systems that valued exclusivity over equality. And now, with every record logged, every video feed secured, and every piece of evidence compiled into an unassailable ledger of truth, the time had come to channel that pain into a movement for reform, one that would challenge and ultimately dismantle the old order. In that transformative moment, high above in the skies where once he had been relegated to a lower-class seat and degraded by the very people entrusted with service and respect, Gerald Harrison had risen. His actions and his resolute silence spoke louder than any outburst could have ever managed, proving once and for all that true power is measured not by the privileges bestowed on a select few, but by the strength of character and the unwavering commitment to justice. His journey had morphed from personal retribution into a battle for the rights and dignity of every individual who had ever been cast aside by an indifferent system. As the private elevator carried him toward his awaiting car and the next phase of a media campaign that was destined to rewrite headlines across the nation, Gerald's mind remained focused on one unalterable truth: that the struggle for equity and justice was a long and arduous road, but that every step taken toward accountability was a triumph over the forces of discrimination. And for every person who had ever sat silently in a lower-class seat, or been dismissed simply because they did not fit a narrow mold, his success was a promise of a fairer future. In the quiet moments before the press briefing, as Gerald Harrison prepared to address the nation from his headquarters, he recalled every slight, every moment of humiliation that had brought him to this point. They were not lost moments, but the very foundation upon which he would build a new era, a future where every act of prejudice and every abuse of power would be met with an orderly, unyielding response that left no room for error. His journey had been long, fraught with pain and bitter injustice, yet it was precisely that pain which had forged him into the man he now was, a man whose quiet revolution would echo through the halls of power for generations to come. To those who have always felt that the scales of life were rigged against them, to those who have been repeatedly told by society that they did not belong in spaces reserved for the privileged. Gerald Harrison's story is both a comfort and a rallying cry. It reminds us that every act of injustice, no matter how small or insidious, is recorded and remembered, and that one day, when the ledger is balanced, there will be a reckoning so spectacular, so complete, that even those who once wielded cruelty and prejudice will be forced to confront the undeniable truth of human dignity. And so, as the terminal filled with the soft hum of incoming media and the quiet murmur of legal officials coordinating every detail of the unprecedented audit, Gerald Harrison prepared himself for the next chapter. His life had been forever changed by the events of that flight, not as a moment of personal victory alone, but as a turning point in the ongoing struggle against systemic injustice. With every recorded detail, every directive issued, and every whisper of hope shared by someone like Grace, his story had transcended the confines of a single airplane and taken on the character of a grand revolution. A revolution that promised to reshape not only corporate culture, but the very fabric of a society long marred by discrimination. In that moment of poised anticipation, as Gerald looked out over the bustling terminal through a vast pane of glass, his reflection merged with that of the plane he had just disembarked from, symbolizing the collision of old ways and new beginnings. His eyes, steady and unflinching, told a story of perseverance, resolve, and the unyielding belief that justice, however long delayed, must and would prevail. For those who had ever felt the sting of isolation, the bitterness of being overlooked simply because of the color of their skin or the depth of their determination, Gerald Harrison's unwavering stand was a beacon of hope, a promise that the power of one determined soul could indeed reshape an entire world. As his car pulled up to the private executive wing, and as he prepared to deliver his first words to an eager national audience, Gerald took one last deep breath. With that breath, he cast aside the ghosts of humiliation and embraced a future where every injustice would be met with undeniable accountability. And in that timeless moment, as the next chapter of his magnificent journey was about to be written, Gerald Harrison's quiet declaration resonated with all who had ever yearned for dignity, that the true measure of a man lies not in his condescension or his entitlement, but in his capacity to turn suffering into strength and oppression into an unstoppable force for change. Gerald Harrison stepped briskly toward the reserve fleet below, his mind still reeling from the stunning reversal that had unfolded on board Flight 849. As he passed one of the large monitors displaying live news alerts, his steps slowed and his eyes fixed on the scrolling headlines. The monitor was broadcasting a breaking news story about the airline incident, and beneath the main headline ran a subsection that caught his attention. Curiosity piqued, Gerald moved closer, tapping the audio feed into his earpiece so he could hear every word. He recognized Heather Carson's voice, once the haughty lead flight attendant whose arrogance and racial bias had contributed to a cascade of humiliations. Now her voice was shaky and stripped of its former authority, yet it resonated with raw, unguarded truth. Heather's statement played softly. "My name is Heather Carson. I was the lead flight attendant on Flight 849. I was terminated yesterday following a corporate review into my conduct. And I want to say something not because I was told to, but because it's overdue." Her voice cracked as she continued, confessing that she had operated from assumption, from comfort, and from inherited bias she had never questioned. "I harmed someone who deserved my service, not my suspicion. I watched the tapes. I saw myself. I was not who I thought I was, and that truth has changed me." Her words, delivered with an honesty that cut like a sharpened knife, sent ripples of transformation far beyond the confines of that single flight. As her message faded out, a new scene appeared on the monitor. A modest building in South Los Angeles, adorned with a banner that read, "Community Flight Initiative, sponsored by Langston Dynamics." There, Heather was shown seated on the front steps in casual clothes. Gone was the crisp, official uniform of a flight attendant. In its place was the vulnerability and resolve of a woman willing to redeem herself. I asked to volunteer here, to work with kids who dream of flying but never see anyone who looks like them in the cockpit. I don't know if it's enough, but it's a beginning, her voice intoned. Gerald felt a powerful surge of vindication. This ripple effect was exactly what he had envisioned. A transformation that went beyond mere compliance or forced apologies. It was a profound and sincere metamorphosis that could reshape the future of an industry built on outdated hierarchies and systemic prejudice. Gerald tapped off his earpiece, feeling that he did not need to hear another word. In that moment, he understood that his actions had not only toppled a regime of humiliation, but had sown the seeds for lasting change. Back at the elevator, his lead assistant approached with a tablet in hand. "Sir, the press is on standby. The boardroom is ready. Would you like to prep your talking points?" The question hung in the air for a moment before Gerald shook his head firmly. "No. We don't control this moment with words," he replied in a deliberate, almost whispering tone that carried the weight of finality. "Let our actions speak." With that, the elevator doors slid closed behind him, sealing off the past as he ascended toward the next phase of his public engagement. As the elevator climbed, Gerald's thoughts drifted briefly to the passengers who had witnessed his transformation. He remembered the father holding his son near the glass, the little boy's eyes wide with wonder as they gazed at a jet parked outside. That moment crystallized in his mind, a poignant reminder that this struggle was larger than any one man. It was about reclaiming the future for all those who had been sidelined or dismissed because of their skin color or background. In that gaze of innocent wonder, Gerald saw the promise of a world where every child could aspire to fly without prejudice, where the legacy of disdain and unchecked power could finally be overturned. Outside the jet bridge, black SUVs marked with the discreet insignia of Langston Dynamics' Internal Ethics Task Force lined the tarmac, their presence a silent but undeniable testament to the sweeping retribution now in motion. Senior officers in dark suits moved with precision and quiet authority, their eyes fixed on the unfolding drama. Every detail, every recorded insult, every act of racial cruelty was now part of an immutable ledger that the world would soon examine with wide-eyed astonishment. By the time Gerald's car pulled up to the private executive wing of Los Angeles International Airport, the storm of change was already upon them. The buzz of news outlets and the murmur of corporate teams preparing for the upcoming press briefing underscored the sense that this was no isolated incident, but a watershed moment in the battle against systemic injustice. Gerald paused at the entrance, looking back one last time through a wide pane of glass that reflected not just his own determined face, but the silhouette of the plane that had carried him through his most demeaning hour. In that final, decisive moment, Gerald Harrison, once treated as just another passenger, now revealed as a titan of accountability, embodied a new era of empowerment. His quiet revolution, meticulously executed and deeply resonant, had transformed humiliation into powerful, permanent change. His legacy, forged in the crucible of discrimination and forged anew by precise, measured action, would ripple through generations, rewriting the narrative for every individual who had ever been made to feel inferior. And as he stepped confidently into his waiting car, Gerald knew that his fight for dignity and justice was not only victorious, but had just begun.